September 14, 2023, Austrian Alps Haute Tauern Range. The GPS coordinates read 47,0892 degrees north, 7,186 degrees east, a remote stretch of mountainside 43 kilometers southwest of Salzburg, elevation 2,187 meters. Klaus Brenner, a glaciologist with the Austrian Academy of Sciences, crouches in melting permafrost, his gloved hands brushing away decades of frozen earth and decomposed organic matter. The climate research team had come here to document glacial recession patterns, armed with ground-penetrating radar and core sampling equipment. They expected ice data. They found something else entirely. "There's a structure here," Brenner calls to his colleague, Dr. Sophie Waldheim, who's checking thermal imaging readings 30 meters downslope. Timber supports, stone foundation, deliberately concealed. What emerges over the next 6 hours of careful excavation defies every expectation. A stone shelter, approximately 4.2 meters by 3.8 meters, built directly into the mountainside and camouflaged with local rock. The entrance, once hidden behind a boulder formation, has partially collapsed due to decades of freeze-thaw cycles. Inside, preserved by the Alpine cold, lies a time capsule from the final days of World War II. The shelter contains a military-grade sleeping bag, manufactured by the Wehrmacht Supply Division, catalog number WH1943789. 3 empty Coca-Cola tins, the chocolate rations favored by German mountain troops, a Telefunken radio receiver, model T38, non-functional but intact, a first aid kit with morphine ampules dated March 1945, maps of the Tyrol region marked with penciled routes, and something that makes Brenner's hands shake as he photographs it with evidence-grade care: a leather document wallet containing military identification papers. The papers identify the shelter's occupant as Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer, born February 8, 1911 in Munich. Service number 03409782. Wehrmacht here, attached to Army Group E Balkan Theater, blood type A positive. The photograph shows a lean-faced man with deep-set eyes, prominent cheekbones, and the hardened expression of someone who'd spent years in combat zones. But here's what stops the investigation cold. According to official military records maintained by the Deutsche Dienststelle, German military archive, in Berlin, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer died on April 27, 1945, in Skopje Loka, Slovenia, killed during a partisan ambush while retreating with the remainder of his regiment. Body never recovered due to combat conditions. Death certificate filed May 30, 1945, by surviving unit commander Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich. Next of kin, wife Marguerite Hofer and daughter Anneliese Hofer, notified June 12, 1945. Pension claim processed September 1946. Yet here, 312 kilometers northwest of his supposed death site, sits clear evidence that someone inhabited this shelter for an extended period after April 27, 1945. The morphine ampules are dated March 1945, but forensic analysis would later determine the shelter was occupied into at least June or July based on pollen samples and food remnants. The maps show penciled annotations marking safe routes through American and French occupation zones. A journal fragment, water-damaged but partially legible, contains entries dated May 3rd through May 18, 1945, more than a week after Hofer's official death. Dr. Waldheim finds a second discovery 30 meters from the main shelter, a carefully constructed cairn covering a sealed metal ammunition box. Inside, 127 gold coins, a mixture of Swiss francs and Austrian ducats, wrapped in wax paper. Beneath the coins, forged identity documents bearing the name Hans Mitterer, born 1906 in Innsbruck, occupation listed as mining engineer. The photograph on the false papers shows the same man as the Wehrmacht ID, but civilian clothing and different glasses create enough distinction for a casual observer to miss the match. By nightfall on September 14th, the Austrian Federal Criminal Police Office, Bundeskriminalamt, has secured the site. By September 16th, forensic teams from Vienna arrive with portable laboratories. By September 22nd, an international investigation begins involving German Federal Archives, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and historical researchers from 3 countries, because one critical question demands answering. If Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer died in Slovenia on April 27, 1945, as official records claim, then who built this shelter, stocked it with survival supplies, marked those maps, wrote those journal entries, and buried that gold? And if Hofer survived the war's end, where did he go next? And how long did he live in freedom while history recorded him as another casualty of Germany's collapse? The contradiction between documented death and material evidence of survival suggests something far more calculated than luck. A meticulously planned escape executed in the chaos of Germany's final defeat, utilizing resources, connections, and geographical knowledge that only someone with Hofer's specific background could have assembled. The shelter represents not a desperate hiding place, but a waypoint, one carefully prepared node in a larger escape network that would keep this man alive and undetected for decades while his family mourned. His military service concluded in paperwork, and his name faded into the archival silence of Germany's fallen. If you want to see what investigators found when they traced Friedrich Hofer's journey beyond that Alpine shelter, when they discovered where the escape route led, what identity he lived under, and how long he survived in plain sight, hit the like button and subscribe. Because this story doesn't end on that Austrian mountainside. It only begins there. Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer entered the world in Munich's Schwabing district on February 8, 1911, the third son of Johann Hofer, a cartographer employed by the Bavarian State Survey Office, and Elsa Hofer, née Bergmann, a schoolteacher. The Hofer household was middle-class, educated, and steeped in the geographic precision that would later define Friedrich's military career. Johann Hofer specialized in Alpine topographical mapping, spending summers surveying mountain regions from Switzerland to Yugoslavia, often bringing young Friedrich along on expeditions from age 12 onward. By 16, Friedrich could read terrain better than men twice his age. He understood elevation gains, approach routes, natural concealment positions, and how landscape features created tactical advantages or vulnerabilities. This wasn't theoretical knowledge. He'd spent 4 summers mapping the Dolomites, the Erztal Alps, and sections of the Julian Alps with his father's survey teams, sleeping in mountain huts, learning routes that appeared on no civilian maps. He completed gymnasium education in 1929 with distinction in mathematics and geography. Rather than pursue university studies, Friedrich enlisted in the Reichswehr on October 1, 1929, joining the 19th Infantry Regiment based in Munich. The Reichswehr, limited by Versailles Treaty restrictions to 100,000 men, accepted only the most capable recruits, and Hofer's mountain expertise made him exceptionally valuable. By 1932, he'd been selected for Alpine warfare training, with the specialist Gebirgsjäger units being quietly developed in Bavaria. Promotion came steadily. Unteroffizier in 1933, Feldwebel in 1936. When Germany remilitarized and the Wehrmacht expanded in 1935, Hofer's expertise in mountain warfare positioned him perfectly for rapid advancement. He attended officer training school in Dresden from January to August 1937, graduating third in his class of 48 candidates. Commissioned as lieutenant, he returned to the newly designated 99th Gebirgsjäger Regiment. On June 17, 1938, Friedrich married Marguerite Schiller, the daughter of a Frankfurt banker. She was 24, he was 27. By all accounts preserved in family letters, later recovered from Marguerite's cousin in 1987 and now archived in Munich's Institute for Contemporary History. Theirs was a genuine love match. not a strategic alliance. Marguerite wrote to her sister in August 1938, "Friedrich is unlike the other officers. He speaks quietly, reads philosophy, and can identify every Alpine flower by its Latin name. He carries maps the way other men carry photographs." Their daughter, Anneliese, was born April 2, 1939, in Munich. Photographs from this period, preserved in military personnel files, show a transformation in Hofer's bearing. The lean-faced officer appears softer, almost gentle, holding his infant daughter. Marguerite wrote that he could quiet Anneliese's crying by humming Alpine folk songs his own father had taught him during mountain surveys. But 1939 brought catastrophic change. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st. Hofer's regiment mobilized, though the Gebirgsjäger units saw limited action in Poland's relatively flat terrain. His real deployment came in April 1940, when Wehrmacht mountain troops spearheaded the invasion of Norway, securing strategic ports and mountain passes. Hofer, now promoted to Oberleutnant, commanded a reconnaissance company during the Narvik campaigns. His after-action reports, declassified in 1998, demonstrate tactical brilliance. Flanking movements using terrain features, minimal casualties, objectives secured through surprise and positioning rather than frontal assault. Norway taught Hofer two crucial lessons that would later enable his survival. First, how small units could move through hostile territory by exploiting geography. Second, how forged documents and assumed identities could fool occupation authorities when executed with confidence and attention to detail. He'd witnessed Norwegian resistance fighters disappear into civilian populations, seen how false papers worked when the issuing authority no longer existed to verify them. Promotion to Hauptmann came in October 1940. Through 1941 and early 1942, Hofer's unit participated in Balkan operations, Yugoslavia's invasion in April 1941, and subsequent anti-partisan operations in occupied territories. Here the Wehrmacht's mountain warfare expertise proved essential. Yugoslavia's rugged terrain favored defenders, requiring tactical sophistication to clear resistant strongholds. Wehrmacht records show Hofer received the Iron Cross Second Class in June 1941 for actions near Pristina, and the Iron Cross First Class in September 1942 for a particularly difficult operation in the Dermitor Mountains of Montenegro. But these commendations came at psychological cost. Letters to Marguerite, intercepted by Allied intelligence and preserved in British National Archives, reveal growing disillusionment. "We are not fighting soldiers here, but farmers with hunting rifles. Yesterday we burned a village that fired on our supply convoy. I wonder what my father would think of the maps I'm drawing now, not for surveying beauty, but for targeting destruction." By 1943, Hofer had been promoted to major and assigned to operations planning for Army Group E, the Wehrmacht formation controlling Greece and Yugoslavia. This position gave him access to strategic intelligence, Allied bombing priorities, partisan network assessments, and crucially, contingency plans for Wehrmacht withdrawal should the Eastern Front collapse. He understood, earlier than most, that Germany would lose the war. The question became not if defeat would come, but how to survive it. In February 1943, catastrophe struck his personal life with devastating finality. Marguerite and 9-year-old Anneliese were visiting Marguerite's parents in Frankfurt when RAF Bomber Command conducted Operation Point-Blank raids on the night of February 12th. The Schiller family home took a direct hit from a 4,000-pound HC cookie bomb. All four occupants, Marguerite, Anneliese, and Marguerite's parents, died instantly in the resulting inferno. Friedrich Hofer received notification by telegram on February 15th, while stationed in Athens. His commanding officer, Generalleutnant Karl von Steinberg, noted in his private diary, later recovered by American forces and now held at the U.S. National Archives, that Hofer became a different man after his family's death. He performed duties with mechanical precision but showed no emotion whatsoever. I feared he might become reckless, but instead he became calculating. He requested intensive maps of every region we controlled, studying escape routes as though planning for our eventual defeat. I should have disciplined this defeatism, but the man had lost everything. I allowed him his maps. This assessment proved prescient. From February 1943 through May 1945, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer, promoted to that rank in January 1944, began a secret parallel operation alongside his official military duties. While planning Wehrmacht defensive operations and anti-partisan sweeps, he simultaneously assembled an escape network. Safe houses, supply caches, forged documents, gold reserves, and most critically, detailed knowledge of every mountain pass, border crossing, and occupation zone boundary from the Balkans to Austria. His position gave him perfect access. As operations officer, he controlled logistics, authorized supply requisitions, and coordinated intelligence from multiple Wehrmacht units. When he diverted gold coins taken from occupied territories into personal accounts, when he authorized construction of observation posts that were actually supply shelters, when he requisitioned false identity papers for undercover operatives, nobody questioned the decorated officer who'd lost his family to Allied bombs and continued serving with grim efficiency. By late 1944, with Soviet forces advancing from the east and Allied armies from the west, Hofer's preparations intensified. He established contact with forgers in Zagreb and Vienna who could produce civilian documents. He buried caches of gold and currency along potential escape routes through Austria and into Switzerland or Italy. He memorized the networks of mountain refuges his father had documented decades earlier, structures that appeared on no military maps because they predated Wehrmacht occupation. But Hofer possessed one advantage beyond planning ability. He genuinely believed he had nothing left to lose. His family was dead. His country was collapsing. The ideals he'd served, if he'd ever truly believed them, had been incinerated in the same Allied firestorm that killed his wife and daughter. What remained was purely biological survival instinct, channeled through the rigorous training of a professional soldier, and the geographic knowledge of someone who understood mountains the way sailors understand currents. Wehrmacht personnel records show Oberstleutnant Hofer as efficient, decorated, and utterly dedicated. What they don't show is a man who'd spent 27 months preparing to disappear. April 23, 1945, Wehrmacht headquarters, Skopje Loka, Slovenia. Spring rain hammers against the commandeered school building's windows as Oberstleutnant Friedrich Hofer reviews troop disposition reports. Army Group E is disintegrating. Soviet forces have taken Vienna. Partisan activity has made every supply route a death trap. The Wehrmacht units still operating in Yugoslavia and Slovenia are no longer fighting. They're fleeing, hopping to reach British or American lines before Soviet forces arrive to exact revenge for 4 years of occupation brutality. Hofer's immediate superior, Generalmajor Werner Kampf, issued orders 3 days prior: prepare defensive positions around Ljubljana to delay partisan advances while evacuating supplies and personnel northward toward the Austrian border. It's a holding action with no strategic purpose except buying time for retreat. Everyone in the headquarters building knows the war is over. They're simply trying to survive its ending. The official record, established by testimony from Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich and filed with Wehrmacht Personnel Command on May 30th, 1945, states that Oberstleutnant Hofer volunteered to lead a reconnaissance patrol on April 27th to assess partisan strength near the Paljan Valley, 15 kilometers northwest of Skopje Loka. The patrol, Hofer plus 6 enlisted men, departed at 5:45 hours in a Kubelwagen light vehicle and a supply truck. They never returned. At 13:20 hours, Jeffrader Hans Müller, sole survivor of the patrol, staggered back into Wehrmacht lines with shrapnel wounds and a report of catastrophe. partisan ambush at coordinates 46, 1583 degrees N, 14, 2167 degrees E, approximately 11:45 hours. Heavy machine gun fire from concealed positions. Kubelwagen destroyed by Molotov cocktail. Multiple casualties. Müller had seen Oberstleutnant Hofer hit by rifle fire, falling from the vehicle as it burned. The survivors scattered into forest. Müller managed to evade pursuers and make his way back, but the others, including Hofer, were certainly dead or captured by partisans, which amounted to the same fate. Hauptmann Dietrich recorded this version in official after-action reports. The Wehrmacht unit evacuated Skopje Loka on April 30th, moving north toward Austria as partisan forces closed in. No body recovery was attempted. Combat conditions made it impossible. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer's death was recorded as killed in action against partisan forces. Location Palgen Valley. Date April 27, 1945. His name joined 5.3 million other Wehrmacht casualties, one more statistic in Germany's military collapse. But the official record is fiction. Here's what actually happened. April 23, 8:30 hours. Hofer meets privately with Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich in a storage room beneath the headquarters building. Dietrich is 32, from Hamburg, family killed in 1943 firebombing. He and Hofer have discussed the coming collapse for weeks, speaking in careful euphemisms about post-war considerations and alternative options. Now, with days remaining before Army Group E's total disintegration, they speak plainly. "The plan requires your cooperation," Hofer says, spreading a map across a wooden crate. "You'll report an ambush. I'll be killed officially. You'll survive to testify." "What do I receive?" Dietrich asks. The question is pragmatic, not accusatory. Officers negotiate survival now like commodities traders. "Gold, 50 Swiss francs in coins buried at these coordinates." Hofer marks a location 30 kilometers north near Cranj. Retrievable once you reach Allied lines. Also documentation placing you elsewhere during certain actions against civilians last October. You were sick, remember. Documented illness. Not present for the village reprisals. This matters. Both men understand that war crimes tribunals will follow Germany's defeat. Alibi documentation could mean the difference between imprisonment and freedom. Hofer, with his access to personnel records and medical files, can create retroactive excuses for chosen officers. Dietrich studies the map. What about the others in the patrol? Real volunteers, soldiers wanting to disappear. I've selected 6 men with reasons to vanish: war crimes exposure, Soviet captivity fears, families in eastern territories now occupied by Russians. They'll scatter at the ambush site, each taking false identity papers. You'll be the sole survivor to report my death. April 25th, 15:30 hours. Hofer makes final preparations. He's already moved his primary gold cache, 387 coins, total value approximately 8,000 Swiss francs, to the Alpine shelter his work teams built 6 months earlier under pretense of constructing an observation post. The shelter sits 43 kilometers inside Austria, far enough from combat zones to remain undiscovered, remote enough that retreating armies won't stumble upon it. He packs civilian clothes, false identity papers in the name Hans Mitterer, maps marking safe routes through Allied occupation zones, medical supplies, compact food rations, and the Telefunken radio receiver for monitoring Allied communications. Everything fits in a Gebirgsjäger mountain pack weighing 18 kilograms. Heavy, but manageable for someone with his conditioning. His Wehrmacht uniform will be abandoned after the staged ambush. The Friedrich Hofer who entered military service in 1929 will officially die at age 34 in a Slovenian valley. The Hans Mitterer who emerges from an Alpine shelter in June 1945 will have no military history, no war crimes exposure, no reason for Allied authorities to investigate closely. April 26, 1900 hours. Final briefing with the 6 patrol members in a barn outside Skafjaloka. Each man receives forged papers, gold coins for expenses, and map coordinates for separate escape routes. They're not fleeing together. That would draw attention. They're dissolving as individuals into Central Europe's displaced millions. Unteroffizier Klaus Reinhardt, age 28, from Dresden, now Soviet-occupied, will become Joseph Wenzel, Austrian farmer. Gefreiter Hans Müller, who will play the wounded survivor, will genuinely be grazed by rifle fire during the staged ambush to make his wounds authentic. Afterwards, he'll desert properly and head for Switzerland using separate documentation. No contact after tomorrow, Hofer instructs them. You don't know each other. You were never part of this patrol. Your Wehrmacht service ended in chaos and you walked home like 10,000 others. Clear. They understand. The Wehrmacht's dissolution means millions of soldiers simply abandoning units, shedding uniforms, walking toward home territories. Military authority has evaporated. In this context, disappearing is easy if you've planned properly. April 27th, 5:45 hours. The patrol departs Skafjaloka. Kubelwagen carries Hofer plus 3 men. Supply truck follows with the remaining 3. They drive northwest on rutted roads, passing columns of refugees heading in the opposite direction, fleeing expected partisan reprisals. The landscape shows war's devastation. Burned farmhouses, abandoned equipment, shell craters still smoking from recent artillery exchanges. 10:37 hours. They reach the designated site, coordinates 46, 1,583 degrees N, 14, 2,167 degrees E, a forested valley with thick tree cover and steep ridgelines, perfect for a believable ambush scenario. More importantly, it's 7 kilometers from the nearest Wehrmacht positions, meaning no immediate reinforcements would arrive to complicate the deception. Hofer checks his watch. Synchronizing the staging requires precision. Hans, you'll fire the machine gun bursts at 11:45 hours exactly. Aim high, we want noise, not casualties. Klaus, set the Kubelwagen fire at 11:47. Make it dramatic. Everyone else, scatter by 11:50 using your designated routes. Questions? None. They've rehearsed this mentally for days. 11:43 hours. They position the vehicles. Hofer places his Wehrmacht identification, medals, and insignia inside the Kubelwagen. These need to burn convincingly. He keeps only his Soldbuch military pay book, with the photograph matching his false papers, which he'll destroy separately later. 11:45 hours. Müller opens fire with the MG-42 machine gun, 3 long bursts into the tree canopy. The sound is apocalyptic, echoing through the valley. Any distant observers will hear this as genuine combat. 11:46 hours. Prepositioned gasoline containers ignite the Kubelwagen. Flames consume the vehicle's interior, creating thick black smoke visible for kilometers. The Wehrmacht insignia, identification papers, everything connecting the vehicle to Oberstleutnant Hofer transforms into ash and melted metal. 11:47 hours. Controlled chaos. The men scatter in predetermined directions, some firing weapons randomly to simulate panic. Klaus Reinhardt deliberately cuts Gefreiter Müller's left arm with a knife, a shallow wound that bleeds impressively but won't cause permanent damage. Müller, now genuinely wounded, begins his escape back toward Wehrmacht lines, where he'll arrive at 13:20 hours with his survivor's testimony. 11:48 hours. Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer, now wearing civilian hiking clothes beneath his Wehrmacht uniform, strips the uniform completely and buries it under forest deadfall. He retains only his boots. Military quality matters for the terrain ahead, but obscures the Wehrmacht markings with mud and abrasion. From his pack, he retrieves the Hans Mitterer papers, memorizing the biographical details once more. Born 1906, Innsbruck, mining engineer. Draft exempt due to essential industry status. Plausible answers for any checkpoint questioning. 12:05 hours. He's 3 kilometers from the ambush site, moving northeast through heavy forest, using terrain masking techniques learned during 20 years of Alpine operations. He's carrying the Gebirgsjäger pack, a compass, maps memorized so thoroughly he could navigate blindfolded, and enough gold to finance several months of careful living. The official version, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Hofer killed in partisan ambush, is now being created by Jeffrader Müller's approach to Wehrmacht lines, by the burning Kubelwagen, by the scattered evidence of chaotic combat. Hauptmann Dietrich will file reports. Personnel command will process paperwork. Next of kin notification will be sent to a Munich address where no family remains alive to receive it. Meanwhile, the actual Friedrich Hofer walks through Slovenian forest, crossing into Austria under cover of darkness on April 28th, moving with the confidence of someone who studied every ridgeline and forest track for precisely this purpose. April 28th, May 2nd. The journey to the Alpine shelter takes 5 days. Hofer moves only at night, avoiding all roads, using animal trails and streambeds that leave minimal tracks. He bypasses 3 American checkpoints by traversing steep terrain vehicles can't access. He avoids displaced person camps where Allied authorities might document his presence. He encounters no one, intentionally. The landscape is apocalyptic. Austria has become a shattered mirror of what it was. Bombed railways, burned villages, columns of refugees and occupation forces setting up administrative controls. But in the mountains, away from roads and towns, nature provides concealment. Hofer sleeps in caves and under rock overhangs, eating compact rations, moving steadily toward coordinates 47, 0892 degrees N, 12, 7186 degrees E. May 3rd, 6:20 hours. He reaches the Alpine shelter. The camouflaged entrance appears exactly as his work crew left it 8 months earlier. Stone matched to surrounding geology, timber supports disguised as natural deadfall, location chosen for its remoteness from any hiking trails or mountain huts. Inside, everything waits. Additional gold, the radio receiver, detailed maps of escape routes into Italy or Switzerland, medical supplies, food for 6 weeks, and winter clothing for when Alpine weather turns deadly. The shelter represents the critical waypoint, a place to rest, monitor Allied radio broadcasts, assess whether authorities are searching for Wehrmacht fugitives, and plan the next movement phase. The official Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer is dead, killed April 27th in combat, body unrecovered, name already fatting into Wehrmacht casualty statistics. The actual man sits in a stone shelter 2,187 meters above sea level, listening to spring wind howl across the Alpine peaks, and begins planning how Hans Mitterer will live the next 30 years. September 16, 2023. Vienna Bundeskriminalamt Forensic Laboratory. Dr. Stefan Korner, Senior Forensic Document Examiner, spreads the Alpine shelter's recovered papers across a sterile examination table under high-intensity LED lighting. The leather document wallet, preserved by Alpine cold and low humidity, has yielded remarkable artifacts. Wehrmacht identification for Friedrich Hofer, forged civilian papers for Hans Mitterer, and 8 pages of handwritten journal entries dated May 3rd through May 18th, 1945. The preservation is extraordinary, Korner tells his colleague, Dr. Helene Brandt, a forensic ink analyst. 78 years, and we can still conduct full spectroscopic analysis. The cold essentially froze degradation processes. They begin with the Wehrmacht papers. The identification card follows standard 1940-era format, official Wehrmacht eagle stamp, photograph affixed with hide glue, service details in typewriter text. Korner photographs it under various light wavelengths, visible spectrum, ultraviolet, infrared. Under UV illumination, the paper stock shows expected fluorescence patterns consistent with wartime German manufacturing. The hide glue exhibits age-appropriate degradation. The typewriter font matches Olympia Elite models, standard in Wehrmacht administrative offices. This is authentic military documentation, coroner confirms. Issued between 1943 and 1945 based on paper stock analysis and stamp impression depth, not a post-war forgery. The Hans-Mitterer papers tell a different story. Under magnification, coroner identifies subtle irregularities. The official stamp impression shows less depth variation than genuine documents, suggesting a hand-carved replica rather than official government stamp. The paper stock, analyzed through fiber composition testing, comes from Austrian civilian sources, not German government supply. The photograph, showing Hofer in civilian clothes with different glasses, was affixed with synthetic adhesive not commonly available until late 1944, suggesting preparation shortly before Germany's collapse. Professional forgery, coroner declares. Excellent quality would have passed cursory inspection at checkpoints. The forger understood paper sources, stamp replication, and biographical plausibility. This wasn't created by an amateur. The journal entries provide the investigation's first breakthrough. 8 pages, written in careful Gothic script, documenting Hofer's first 16 days in the Alpine shelter. Dr. Brandt conducts ink analysis using Raman spectroscopy, identifying iron gall ink consistent with wartime fountain pens. The handwriting matches exemplars from Hofer's official Wehrmacht reports, stored in German military archives. Same letter formation patterns, identical signature flourishes, matching pressure variations. Content analysis reveals Hofer's state of mind during those isolated weeks. May 3, 1945, arrived at shelter, 6:20 hours, 5 days since the fiction of my death. Radio reports Wehrmacht units surrendering across Austria. The Third Reich lasted 12 years. My marriage lasted 7. Both collapsed in fire. At least Marguerite and Anneliese were spared witnessing this ending. May 7th, radio confirms Germany's unconditional surrender. It's over. I feel nothing. No relief, no grief, nothing. Only cold calculation. Wait 6 weeks, monitor Allied occupation procedures, then proceed to Italy using the southern route. The mountain passes should be clear by late June. May 12th, heavy snow yesterday, unexpected for May. Shelter temperature dropped to -4 degrees C. I burned precious fuel for warmth. This waiting is harder than combat. In battle, you're too occupied to think. Here, there's only thought and memory. I'd prefer to burn like the fuel. May 18th, Allied patrols passed 800 meters below, heading northeast. They weren't searching, just moving through terrain. I remain undetected. Hans-Mitterer exists only in papers and my memorization. Friedrich Hofer is dead, mourned by no one, forgotten already. Perhaps that's appropriate justice. The journal ends May 18th. No entries explain when Hofer left the shelter or where he went next. But the investigation has now established beyond doubt. Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer survived his supposed death, prepared his disappearance methodically, and used the Alpine shelter as a waypoint while planning his next movement. September 23, 2023, German Federal Archives, Berlin. Dr. Markus Schreber, military historian specializing in Wehrmacht personnel records, sits before 3 computers, cross-referencing databases that have taken decades to digitize. The Austrian discovery has triggered international archival cooperation. German, Austrian, Swiss, and Italian repositories all searching for traces of Friedrich Hofer or Hans-Mitterer in post-war documentation. Schreber's team discovers the first anomaly in Swiss border records. On July 3, 1945, a Hans-Mitterer, mining engineer from Innsbruck, entered Switzerland at the Samnon crossing in Graubünden Canton. The border log notes his profession, states he's seeking employment with Swiss mining companies after Austrian operations ceased due to war damage. Swiss authorities, processing thousands of displaced persons weekly, conducted minimal verification. Mitterer presented Austrian civilian identification, had no Wehrmacht connections in his documentation, and demonstrated professional knowledge of mining geology when questioned. He was granted temporary entry status. This matches the timeline, Schreiber explains to his research assistant. 6 weeks in the Alpine shelter, then movement into Switzerland through a remote mountain crossing where security was minimal. The mining engineer cover story is clever. It explains geological knowledge and provides reason for being in mountain regions without raising suspicion. The Swiss trail continues. Mitterer registered with Zurich Employment Services on July 12, 1945, listing an address at a boarding house in the Ossersiel district, a working-class neighborhood where transient workers wouldn't attract attention. Swiss employment records show Mitterer worked at a granite quarry near Illenz from August 1945 through March 1946, earning standard wages, filing proper tax documentation, behaving exactly like thousands of other displaced workers rebuilding post-war lives. But on March 28, 1946, Hans Mitterer closed his Swiss bank account, containing 3,847 Swiss francs, far more than a quarry worker should have accumulated, and departed Switzerland through the Italian border at Chiasso. Swiss exit records note his stated destination as Milano, purpose listed as seeking better employment opportunities. The trail goes cold there for 2 years. October 4, 2023, Simon Wiesenthal Center, Vienna office. Dr. Rachel Stein, researcher specializing in post-war escape networks, joins the investigation with a disturbing revelation. Friedrich Hofer's biography fits the profile of dozens of Wehrmacht officers who disappeared in 1945 and later surfaced in South America, the Middle East, or Spain, protected by networks that smuggled war criminals out of Europe. Was Hofer a war criminal? Stein asks, examining his service record. That's the critical question determining whether this is just a survival story or something darker. The research team examines Hofer's military assignments with forensic attention. His service in Yugoslavia and Greece from 1940 to 1945 placed him in regions where Wehrmacht forces committed extensive atrocities, reprisal killings, village destructions, anti-partisan operations that made no distinction between combatants and civilians. British National Archives provide documentation of specific incidents. In October 1942, Hofer's unit participated in Operation Schneesturm, an anti-partisan sweep through Montenegro that resulted in 147 civilian deaths in 4 villages. After-action reports show Hofer coordinated logistics and provided terrain intelligence for the operation. But nothing directly implicates him in ordering atrocities. He was staff officer, not combat commander in those operations. A crucial document emerges from Yugoslav State Archives, declassified in 2018, testimony from partisan commander Josip Markovic, recorded in June 1945, describing Wehrmacht operations in the Skopje-Loka region. Markovic states, the German staff officer called Hofer was different from the others. He argued against reprisal killings, claiming they increased partisan recruitment. Other officers ignored him. After village burnings, Hofer would be absent from celebrations, sitting alone writing letters. We intercepted one letter where he told his wife he'd become a cartographer of hell, mapping locations that should never have been destroyed. This was April 1943. The timing aligns. April 1943, 1 month after Hofer's family died in RAF bombing. Markovic's testimony suggests moral conflict, not enthusiastic participation in atrocities, but moral conflict doesn't equal innocence. Hofer remained in service, continued providing intelligence for operations, and ultimately fled justice rather than face accountability for his unit's actions. He exists in moral gray space, Stein concludes. Not an enthusiastic war criminal like camp commandants, but not innocent either. He facilitated operations that killed civilians, even if he didn't pull triggers personally. His escape denied victims any justice. October 18, 2023, DNA analysis breakthrough. Dr. Sophie Waldheim, the glaciologist who discovered the shelter, contributes another piece to the puzzle. Biological samples from the shelter's sleeping bag, analyzed by Vienna University's Forensic Genetics Laboratory. DNA extraction from hair follicles and skin cells yields partial STR profiles, enough for familial comparison if living descendants exist. The investigation team locates Hofer's nephew, Karl Hofer, age 79, living in Stuttgart. Karl's father, Friedrich's older brother, survived the war and later spoke rarely of his missing brother. Karl agrees to DNA comparison testing. Results completed October 28, 2023. The Alpine shelter biological samples show genetic markers consistent with paternal lineage relationship to Karl Hofer. Statistical analysis indicates 99.7% probability the shelter's occupant was a sibling of Karl's father. This removes any doubt, Waldheim announces at a press conference on November 3, 2023. The shelter was occupied by Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer. He survived his supposed death, prepared for escape, and successfully disappeared from Allied authorities. But where did he go after Switzerland? November 12, 2023, the Argentina connection. Italian border records, painstakingly reviewed by researchers at Rome's Archivio Centrale dello Stato, provide the next clue. Hans Mitterer entered Italy through Chiasso on March 28, 1946, and registered at a Milano boarding house on April 2. Italian employment records show Mitterer worked at a textile factory in Milano's industrial district from May through September 1946. On September 15, 1946, Hans Mitterer applied for an International Committee of the Red Cross travel document, a standard procedure for displaced persons seeking to emigrate overseas. The application, preserved in ICRC archives in Geneva, lists his destination as Argentina, purpose given as seeking employment in mining industry. The timing is significant. By late 1946, the so-called Rattling networks were operating at full efficiency. Catholic Church officials, sympathetic to anti-communist refugees, and sometimes unable or unwilling to distinguish between political refugees and war criminals, provided assistance, travel documents, and accommodation for Europeans seeking passage to South America. On November 2, 1946, according to passenger manifests preserved at Argentina's National Immigration Office, Hans Mitterer, age 40, actual age 35, but the forged papers added 5 years, boarded the SS Philippa bound for Buenos Aires from Genoa. Occupation listed, mining engineer. Previous residence, Austria. Political affiliation, none stated. This is the classic escape pattern, explains Dr. Stein. Wehrmacht officer creates false identity in 1945, hides until Allied scrutiny decreases, makes his way to Italy where Rattling networks operate, obtains Red Cross travel documents that don't require extensive background verification, and sails to Argentina where immigration authorities asked few questions about European refugees claiming to flee communism. The SS Philippa arrived in Buenos Aires on December 18, 1946. Passenger Hans Mitterer cleared immigration, listed an address at a German-Argentine cultural center in Buenos Aires that provided temporary housing for refugees, and disappeared into Argentina's substantial German-speaking community, estimated at 250,000 people in 1946, with many sympathetic to displaced Germans regardless of their wartime activities. December 6, 2023, the Buenos Aires discovery. Argentine researcher Maria Castellano, working with the investigation team, makes a breakthrough while examining Buenos Aires provincial archives. A Hans Mitterer purchased property in Bariloche, Rio Negro province, on February 23, 1948. The property deed, recorded in the Bariloche Land Registry, describes a small farm, 12 hectares, located in the Andean foothills 40 kilometers west of Bariloche City, a region that became notorious as a refuge for escaped Nazis, including Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, and hundreds of lower-profile fugitives. Bariloche land registry records show Mitterer paid 8,500 Argentine pesos in cash, approximately $4,000 US dollars in 1948 currency, a substantial sum for a supposed mining engineer who'd been in Argentina only 14 months. The money clearly came from Hofer's carefully preserved gold reserves, converted through careful transactions that avoided attracting attention. Local newspaper archives, digitized by Argentina's National Library, provide additional details. The Bariloche newspaper, El Cordillerano, published a brief notice in March 1948 about new Austrian settler Hans Mitterer, establishing a small farm near Colonia Suiza. The notice mentions Mitterer's background in geology and mining, states he's seeking peaceful retirement in mountain landscapes that remind him of his Tyrolean homeland. Retirement at age 37 for a supposed mining engineer makes little sense, unless that mining engineer is actually a 40-year-old fugitive Wehrmacht officer who spent 3 years carefully building an identity that explains his presence in Argentina's German community without inviting scrutiny about wartime activities. December 19, 2023, Letters from the Dead. The investigation's most remarkable discovery comes from an unexpected source. In Munich, while reviewing materials for a planned Wehrmacht documentation exhibition, museum researcher Anna Hoffmann finds a folder of correspondence donated in 1987 by Marguerite Hofer's cousin, Emma Schiller. The folder contains letters sent to Emma between 1948 and 1973, 25 years of correspondence from an old family friend named Hans. The letters, written in careful script that forensic analysis will later confirm matches Friedrich Hofer's handwriting, are masterpieces of coded communication. Ostensibly simple friendly letters about life in Argentina, gardening experiences, and mountain scenery, they contain subtle references that only family members would understand. June 12, 1950. I visited the chapel in Colonia Suiza today, lighting candles for those we lost. The priest said remembrance keeps spirits alive. I lit 3 candles for the ones taken by fire, you know whom I mean. This mountain valley has flowers similar to Alpine Edelweiss. I've planted them near the house, hoping they'll survive transplantation. Some roots are stronger than others. 3 candles for Marguerite, Anneliese, and himself, the person officially dead. Emma Schiller, who knew Friedrich Hofer personally before the war, would have understood the reference. The Edelweiss transplantation is metaphor for his own survival in foreign soil. November 2, 1954. I turned 43 this year, though my documents claim 48. Isn't it strange how paper can add years that life didn't include? I think often of February 1943 and the fire that changed everything. Sometimes I wonder if I died then too, in a different way. The man I was burned with them. What remained is something else. Not better, not worse, just other. This letter directly references Hofer's actual age, 35 in 1946, would be 43 in 1954, versus Hans Mitterer's false birthday. It confirms awareness that his true identity remained hidden while official records declared him dead. September 7, 1962. I received word that Ernst passed away in Hamburg. You remember Ernst, the one who survived when I didn't back in those terrible last days. He kept the story straight all these years, never wavered. I hope his conscience allowed him peace. Mine seldom does, though I've learned to live with ghosts. Ernst Hauptmann Ernst Dietrich, who testified to Hofer's death in the April 1945 partisan ambush. German death records confirm Ernst Dietrich died in Hamburg in September 1962, age 49, cause listed as heart failure. The letter reveals Hofer monitored news from Germany, tracking the fates of those who'd helped him disappear. The correspondence continues through 1973, then ceases. The final letter, dated May 18, 1973, reads, "I'm 72 now according to Hans's papers, though my body knows the truth is 62. The mountains here have been good to me, more mercy than I deserved. I've lived 3 decades longer than I expected in April 1945, longer than Marguerite, longer than Annalise. That debt unpaid weighs heavier each year. If this is my last letter, know that remembrance of home sustained me, even when I couldn't return to it. Some exiles are permanent, and perhaps some should be." Emma Schiller died in 1987, age 93. She donated the letters to her cousin's family with instructions they be preserved as historical documentation, if ever the truth about Friedrich should be needed. By 2023, all parties to the deception have died. Only the letters remain, connecting the Alpine shelter discovered in Austria to a farm in Argentina's mountains, tracing the arc of a man who died officially at 34 but lived actually to 62, or possibly longer. January 15, 2024, International War Crimes Research Conference, The Hague. The investigation into Friedrich Hofer's disappearance has expanded into something far larger, mapping the complete network that enabled his escape and the escapes of potentially hundreds of other Wehrmacht officers and Nazi officials who vanished in 1945 and resurfaced in neutral or sympathetic countries. Dr. Marcus Schraber presents findings to an audience of historians, prosecutors, and archival researchers from 14 countries. Hofer wasn't an isolated case. His escape reveals systematic infrastructure, safe houses, forgers, smuggling routes, financial networks, and corrupt officials. Understanding his specific route illuminates the larger Ratline operations. Researchers have reconstructed Hofer's escape with remarkable precision by cross-referencing the Alpine shelter contents, Swiss border records, Italian documentation, and Argentine archives. Location: 47, 0892 degrees 12, 7,186 degrees, elevation 2,187 meters, Austrian Alps. Purpose: isolated refuge while Allied occupation forces established control over Austria, allowing time for checkpoints and documentation procedures to stabilize. Preparation: the shelter was constructed in October 1944 by a Wehrmacht work detail under Hofer's command, officially described as an observation post for monitoring partisan movements. The 3-soldier crew who built it were later killed in combat during Wehrmacht's retreat, coincidentally or deliberately, eliminating witnesses to the shelter's true purpose. Supplies cached: 387 gold coins, Swiss francs, and Austrian ducats. Civilian clothing, forged Hans Mitterer identity papers, maps marking routes through Allied occupation zones, medical supplies including morphine and antibiotics, compact food rations for 6 weeks, Telefunken radio receiver, and detailed biographical notes to memorize Mitterer's fictitious background. The shelter's location was precisely calculated, remote enough to avoid accidental discovery, yet within a 5-day hike from Swiss border crossings. It sat above the tree line where vegetation wouldn't obscure approaches, allowing Hofer to spot patrols from distance. The stone construction prevented aerial detection by thermal sensors the Allies were beginning to deploy for locating fugitives. Hofer departed the Alpine shelter in late June after monitoring Allied radio broadcasts confirming stable occupation zones and minimal border security in remote mountain regions. He traveled exclusively at night, moving through terrain too steep for vehicle patrols. The route, northwest from the shelter, following the Inn-River Valley while staying above tree line, crossing into Switzerland through the Samnon Pass in Graubünden Canton. This particular crossing was nearly unguarded. Swiss authorities focused resources on major roads and rail lines where most refugee traffic concentrated. At the border, Hofer presented Hans Mitterer papers confidently, carrying a Gebergsäger pack stripped of military markings, dressed in quality hiking clothes that suggested affluent outdoorsman rather than desperate refugee. Border guards asked routine questions about mining experience. Hofer's genuine geological knowledge, learned from his cartographer father, provided convincing answers. He entered Switzerland legally, just another displaced Austrian professional seeking work. This reveals critical pattern. The successful fugitives weren't those who sneaked across borders illegally, but those with quality forged documents who crossed openly, blending with millions of legitimate displaced persons flooding across Europe. Switzerland served as crucial staging territory for fugitives. Neutral during the war, Switzerland attracted displaced persons from all nations. Swiss authorities, overwhelmed by refugee volumes, conducted minimal background investigations unless someone raised specific suspicions. Hofer spent 9 months in Switzerland, carefully building Hans Mitterer's background with genuine documentation, employment at the Illenz quarry, tax records, bank account, residence registration. Each piece added authenticity to the false identity. By March 1946, Hans Mitterer had a verifiable Swiss residency history, making him appear legitimate to Italian authorities when he crossed the next border. The investigation discovered Hofer wasn't isolated in Switzerland. Cross-referencing Swiss employment and residence records from 1940 51947 with Wehrmacht personnel files revealed at least 17 suspected fugitive officers working in Switzerland under assumed identities during the same period, including 3 others at the same Illenz quarry where Hofer worked. This suggests coordination. Someone in Switzerland was directing Wehrmacht fugitives to specific employers who asked few questions and provided legitimate work documentation. The quarry owner, Heinrich Gessler, died 1958, had business connections with German mining companies and demonstrated notable sympathy for victims of Allied aggression. His words, recorded in Swiss business correspondence. Italy became the critical gateway for fugitives heading to South America. The investigation team discovered why Catholic Church officials, particularly in northern Italy, operated assistance networks for refugees fleeing communism. Priests issued testimonials vouching for individuals' character without rigorous verification, believing they were helping anti-communist victims, not war criminals. Hofer entered Italy through Chiasso on March 28, 1946, with Swiss employment documents proving 9 months of stable work history, exactly the kind of refugee background that seemed legitimate rather than suspicious. In Milano, he worked at a textile factory, but devoted efforts to obtaining the critical Red Cross travel documents required for overseas emigration. The International Committee of the Red Cross, overwhelmed by displacement crisis, issued travel documents to stateless persons and displaced individuals who couldn't obtain proper passports. The process required proof of identity. Hofer's Swiss employment records provided this character reference, obtained from a Milano priest whom Hofer attended Mass, careful image cultivation, and stated destination country willing to accept the applicant. Argentina, under Perón's government, welcomed European immigrants, especially those with technical skills or professional backgrounds. Applications were processed with minimal investigation. On September 15, 1946, Hans Mitterer received Red Cross travel document number TR47821, valid for passage to Argentina. The ticket for SS Philippa cost 2,400 Italian lire, paid in cash, converted from Hofer's gold reserves through careful transactions at Milano currency exchanges. By November 2, 1946, 19 months after his death, Friedrich Hofer was aboard a ship bound for Buenos Aires, traveling under internationally recognized documentation, appearing completely legitimate. Passenger manifest analysis reveals disturbing context. Of 847 passengers aboard SS Philippa's November 1946 voyage, at least 23, are now suspected of being fugitive Wehrmacht or SS officers based on biographical inconsistencies discovered through modern database cross-referencing. The ship was essentially a floating escape convoy. Argentina's German community provided perfect cover. With 250,000 German speakers, many sympathetic to refugees' claims of fleeing Soviet-occupied territories, fugitives could disappear into ethnic networks that asked few questions about wartime activities. The Bariloche region specifically attracted escaped Nazis. Its Alpine-like landscape appealed to German and Austrian fugitives psychologically. Mountains, lakes, and forests resembled homeland topography. More practically, the region's remoteness, sparse population, and distance from Buenos Aires government oversight created zones where questionable backgrounds weren't scrutinized. Hofer's property purchase reveals access to substantial funds. The 8,500 pesos, $4,000 US, he paid in cash for 12 hectares represented careful financial management. His original gold reserve, approximately 8,000 Swiss francs in 1945, had been conservatively converted and used across 4 countries over 20 months. He'd worked legitimate jobs to avoid attention while preserving capital for property purchase that would establish permanent residency status. Local Bariloche residents, interviewed by Argentine researchers in 2024, recall Hans the Austrian as quiet, solitary, competent in mountain environments. He kept goats, maintained a garden, and occasionally worked as a guide for German tourists visiting the region. He attended German-language Catholic services, participated minimally in community events, and demonstrated polite but firm boundaries against personal questions. One neighbor, Heinrich Wolf, died 2019, stated in 2017 interview preserved by Bariloche Historical Society. Hans never spoke about the war years. If someone asked, he'd say the past is past and change subjects. Many of us understood there were men in Bariloche with histories they didn't discuss. We respected that silence. Who were we to judge? The war had been terrible for everyone. That communal silence protected not just Hofer, but potentially dozens of war criminals living openly in the region. Adolf Eichmann lived in Buenos Aires suburbs from 1950 until his capture in 1960. Joseph Mengele passed through Argentina before settling in Brazil. Hundreds of lower-profile figures remained undetected, protected by communities that valued ethnic solidarity over moral accountability. The letters to Emma Schiller prove Hofer lived in Bariloche at least until May 1973, when he would have been 62 years old, or 72, according to Hans Mitterer's papers. No death record exists for Hans Mitterer in Argentine archives checked through 1985, suggesting either 1. He died outside official record-keeping systems, possibly in remote mountain areas. 2. He assumed another identity later in life. Or 3. He left Argentina for another destination. The investigation team's best estimate: Friedrich Hofer likely died between 1973 and 1980, somewhere in Argentina's Rio Negro province, and was buried informally, perhaps on his own property, without official documentation. His grave, if it exists, remains undiscovered, making the Austrian Alpine shelter the only physical site definitively connected to his post-war survival. February 8, 2024, what the letters reveal. The 25-year correspondence between Hans and Emma Schiller, analyzed by handwriting experts, psycholinguists, and historians, provides the investigation's deepest insight into Hofer's psychological state during his Argentine exile. Dr. Helena Brandt, forensic psychologist at Vienna University, conducts textual analysis of the letter's emotional content. This is a man living with profound cognitive dissonance. He survived when his family didn't. He escaped justice for actions he partly acknowledges as wrong. He built a new life on foundations of deception. The letters show someone seeking absolution he knows he doesn't deserve. The 1954 letter, contains particularly revealing passage. I walked these mountains thinking of similar walks with my father during survey expeditions. He taught me to read landscapes, to see how water shapes valleys, how geology determines what grows where. Scientific observation, free of emotion, but I can't observe my own life scientifically. I see only contradictions. I'm a dead man who breathes. I'm a fugitive who walks freely. I'm a father who lost his daughter but never faced what other fathers lost because of operations I helped plan. The mountains here are beautiful, but they're the wrong mountains. Even if I could return to Austria, I couldn't return to who I was. That person died with Marguerite and Anneliese. What survived is something incomplete. This suggests Hofer recognized moral bankruptcy in his escape, but chose survival anyway, making him complicit not just in wartime actions, but in post-war evasion of accountability. Evidence of financial resources. Argentine property records reveal additional purchases beyond the initial 1948 farm. In 1952, Hans Mitterer bought adjacent property, expanding his holdings to 19 hectares. In 1959, he purchased a small apartment in Bariloche City, suggesting financial stability and long-term settlement intentions. Where did the continued funding originate? The initial gold reserves couldn't sustain property purchases for 15 years. The investigation team theorizes three possibilities. Conservative investment. Hofer may have invested his initial capital carefully, living modestly while allowing funds to grow through Argentine banking system. Underground economy. Bariloche's German community included networks that employed fugitives informally, paying cash wages that circumvented official records. External support. Some Ratline networks continued supporting fugitives for years after initial escape, funded by sympathizers or organizations ideologically committed to protecting former Reich officials. Banking records from Switzerland, declassified through international law enforcement cooperation, reveal that account 47221943 at Zurich's Bank Leu, now absorbed into Credit Suisse, opened in July 1945 by Hans Mitterer, showed periodic transactions until account closure in March 1971. Deposits and withdrawals suggest the account served as financial reserve, carefully accessed to avoid drawing attention. The 1971 closure timing is significant. It corresponds with growing international pressure on Swiss banks to cooperate with war crimes investigations and increasing scrutiny of accounts potentially connected to escaped Nazis. Hofer may have closed the account preventively, transferring remaining funds to Argentine banks or converting to physical assets. Connections to other fugitives. Argentine intelligence records, partially declassified in 2023, contain surveillance notes on German community activities in Bariloche during the 1960s. One report from 1963 mentions Hans Mitterer, Austrian settler, attending a gathering at the Deutsch-Argentinische Kulturverein, German-Argentine Cultural Association, where Walther Roth, former SS officer responsible for mobile gas chambers, was also present. The report doesn't suggest Hofer and Roth had personal relationship, but it confirms both men moved in overlapping social circles, networks of German-speaking expatriates that inevitably included war criminals alongside legitimate refugees. This moral contamination by association raises questions. Did Hofer know he socialized with mass murderers? Did he care? Or had his own moral calculus so rationalized survival that proximity to greater evil felt unremarkable? Emma Schiller's testimony. Before her death in 1987, Emma Schiller provided oral history interview to Munich's Institute for Contemporary History, recorded on audio tape and preserved in their archives. Researcher Anna Hoffman discovered this tape in December 2023 while investigating the letter collection. In the interview, 83-year-old Emma discusses her cousin Marguerite and the tragedy of Friedrich. Marguerite loved him absolutely. She believed he was different from the fanatics that he served because one had to serve, not from conviction. After she died, I received notification that Friedrich had been killed too. I mourned him. Then in 1948, a letter arrived from Argentina, signed only H, referencing things only Friedrich would know, pet names for Marguerite, details about Anneliese's birth, memories of family gatherings. I understood immediately. I never told anyone. Who would I tell? Marguerite was dead. Anneliese was dead. Friedrich legally didn't exist anymore. What purpose would revelation serve except to hurt his remaining family? So I kept his letters, wrote back occasionally, maintained the connection to his former life. Did I do wrong? I've asked myself for 40 years. He was complicit in terrible things, I don't deny that. But he also lost everything. His punishment wasn't prison, but living as a ghost, unable to return home, carrying guilt I could read between every line he wrote. Perhaps that's insufficient justice for the families who suffered from Wehrmacht operations, but it's the only justice that existed by the time I learned he'd survived. I donated these letters now because all of us, me, Friedrich, Marguerite, that whole generation, are dying. When we're gone, only documents remain. Let historians judge whether his survival was acceptable. I only maintained family connection to someone who'd become a stranger even to himself. Emma's testimony reveals the complicity of ordinary people in fugitive survival. Not active assistance, but passive acceptance. Familial loyalty overriding civic duty to expose wanted individuals. The final mystery. No death record exists for Hans Mitterer in Argentine databases through 1990. This creates three possible scenarios. Scenario 1. Hofer died in Rio Negro province between 1973 and 1980, was buried informally on private property, and his death went unreported to authorities. This was common practice in remote Argentine regions where government record-keeping remained incomplete. Scenario 2. Hofer assumed a third identity in later life, perhaps when Hans Mitterer's aging began attracting questions about documented age versus apparent age. He may have died, officially as Mitterer, while continuing to live under another name. Scenario 3. Hofer left Argentina in the 1970s for another destination, Paraguay, Brazil, or Chile, where smaller German communities provided even less scrutiny. He may have died in one of those countries under unknown identity. The investigation team considers scenario 1 most probable. Hofer's letters suggest deepening attachment to his Bariloche property, declining interest in mobility, and resignation to permanent exile. His physical and psychological state in the 1973 letter, 72 according to papers, 62 in body, suggests someone preparing for life's end, not new adventures. If Hofer is buried on the property he purchased in 1948, his grave would be unmarked, his remains unidentified, his final resting place known only to the Argentine earth that received him, creating a grim symmetry with the thousands of his victims buried in unmarked mass graves across Yugoslavia, whose deaths he helped facilitate, whose justice remained undelivered. March 2024, Conference on War Crimes Accountability, Berlin. The discovery of Friedrich Hofer's Alpine shelter and reconstruction of his escape has reignited decades-old debates about post-war justice, moral accountability, and the thousands of perpetrators who evaded consequences for wartime actions. Dr. Rachel Stein presents the case to an audience of prosecutors, historians, and victims' advocacy groups. Friedrich Hofer represents a moral category that makes us uncomfortable, the indirect perpetrator. He didn't run concentration camps. He didn't personally execute civilians. But his intelligence work, logistics planning, and tactical coordination enabled operations that killed hundreds of Yugoslav partisans and civilians. How do we evaluate culpability when someone facilitated evil without directly committing atrocities? The question generates heated discussion. Some argue Hofer's staff officer role makes him fully complicit in Wehrmacht war crimes, deserving prosecution had he been captured. Others suggest his moral complexity, documented discomfort with reprisal killings, psychological devastation from family loss, distinguishes him from enthusiastic war criminals like Eichmann or Mengele. But this debate reveals an uncomfortable truth. Germany's post-war justice system would likely never have prosecuted Hofer even if he'd remained in Europe. Wehrmacht officers faced prosecution only for direct atrocities, torture, execution orders, concentration camp administration. Staff officers who provided intelligence and logistics rarely stood trial unless documentation proved they'd ordered specific war crimes. Hofer might have lived openly in post-war Germany, like tens of thousands of former Wehrmacht officers who reintegrated into civilian life, became businessmen, teachers, government officials. His escape wasn't legally necessary. It was psychologically necessary, driven by fear of what he'd become and inability to face the ruins of the world he'd helped destroy. Dr. Yale Cohen, historian specializing in Holocaust studies, offers a different perspective. We focus on whether Hofer deserved prosecution, but that misses the larger point. His escape denied victims any possibility of justice, accountability, or truth. Yugoslav families who lost relatives in operations Hofer helped plan never received acknowledgement, compensation, or even certainty about what happened. His survival maintained lies, official death records that erased his continued existence, false identities that obscured his past. This denial is its own crime. Justice isn't only about punishment. It's about truth, acknowledgement, the perpetrator facing victims, and admitting what was done. Hofer's escape stole that from hundreds of families. His comfortable life in Argentina, while victims' families struggled with poverty, trauma, and uncertainty, represents profound moral injustice regardless of whether law would have convicted him. The numbers behind one escape. Historians estimate between 5,000 and 10,000 Nazi officials, SS officers, and Wehrmacht personnel escaped Europe between 1945 and 1955, using ratline networks similar to what Hofer utilized. These weren't all concentration camp guards or genocide architects. Many were mid-level administrators, logistics officers, intelligence analysts whose specific crimes remained undocumented but whose overall complicity in the Reich's machinery made them fear prosecution. For every Adolf Eichmann captured in 1960, dozens of lesser-known perpetrators died peacefully in exile, their graves unmarked, their fates unknown to the families of their victims. The Alpine shelter discovery reminds us that these weren't abstract historical events. They were specific individuals making calculated choices to evade accountability, using resources stolen from victims, traveling through networks that valued ethnic solidarity over justice. The gold coins buried in Hofer's Alpine shelter came from somewhere. Wehrmacht officers acquired gold through official pay, but also through confiscation from occupied territories, forced purchases at disadvantageous rates, and outright looting. Each of Hofer's 387 coins potentially represents wealth stolen from Yugoslav, Greek, or Italian families, converted into escape currency, buried in Austrian mountainside, then used to build comfortable exile in Argentina. This isn't speculation. Wehrmacht economic exploitation of occupied territories is exhaustively documented. Officers with Hofer's access to logistics and supply systems participated in this exploitation, whether they personally confiscated wealth or simply benefited from a system that redirected occupied territories' resources toward German military and personal use. The families left behind. Documentation in Munich archives reveals the impact on Hofer's surviving family. His parents, Johann and Elsa Hofer, received notification in June 1945 that their son had been killed in action. They mourned him alongside their daughter-in-law and granddaughter, all dead within 2 years. Johann Hofer, the cartographer who taught his son to read mountains, died in 1948 at age 74. Elsa survived until 1956. Neither ever knew their son had lived beyond 1945. Their grief was based on deception Friedrich chose to maintain, protecting himself by letting his parents believe him dead, accepting their mourning as necessary cost of his survival. Did this cause him psychological suffering? His letters to Emma suggest yes, but that suffering doesn't absolve the choice. He prioritized his survival over his parents' right to know their son lived. That calculation reveals character. When forced to choose between his safety and his family's peace of mind, he chose himself. The contemporary relevance. Modern war crimes tribunals, International Criminal Court, tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, operate on principles partially developed in response to post-WWII justice failures. The thousands of perpetrators who escaped through ratlins like Hofer's demonstrated that justice delayed is justice denied. Contemporary international law emphasizes swift prosecution, comprehensive documentation, and elimination of safe havens for war criminals. Yet the Hofer case reminds us that moral accountability transcends legal prosecution. Even if law can't reach someone, history can judge them. Even if they die peacefully in exile, their choices can be exposed, documented, and condemned. The Alpine shelter discovery, 78 years after the escape it facilitated, proves that secrets eventually surface. This creates a form of justice through historical truth. Friedrich Hofer escaped legal consequences, but he cannot escape historical judgment. His name is now permanently associated with escape, complicity, and evasion. Future historians studying Wehrmacht officer corps, post-war ratlins, and moral failures of that generation will reference his case. He achieved physical survival but lost historical reputation, insufficient punishment perhaps, but better than complete anonymity. The question for contemporary society: how many other Alpine shelters, buried caches, and escape waypoints remain undiscovered? How many fugitives lived full lives in exile, died peacefully, and left no evidence of their survival? For every Hofer whose refuge melted from a glacier, how many other secrets remain permanently hidden? And what responsibility do we bear, decades later, to continue searching for truth even when all participants are dead, when prosecution is impossible, when the only available justice is historical acknowledgement of what happened? June 2024, return to the Alpine shelter. The Austrian government has preserved the site at coordinates 47,0892 degrees N, 12, 7,186 degrees E as historical documentation of post-war escape networks. A small memorial plaque, installed in May 2024, reads in German and English. In this shelter, Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer of the Wehrmacht hid in 1945 after staging his death, beginning an escape to South America. This site represents both individual survival and systemic failure of post-war justice. It reminds us that accountability cannot be evaded indefinitely. Earth eventually yields its secrets. Standing at the shelter entrance, looking across the Austrian Alps toward Slovenia, where Hofer supposedly died, one can trace the geography of his escape. Southwest to Slovenia for the staged ambush, north through these mountains to the shelter, west over those ridges toward Switzerland. Each sightline represents a route he'd studied for years, preparing obsessively for the moment when Germany's collapse would require either facing consequences or disappearing. The landscape hasn't changed substantially since 1945. The same peaks, the same valleys, the same stone and ice. But the glacier that preserved Hofer's refuge for 78 years has receded 187 meters, exposing the shelter that was never meant to be found. Climate change, ironically, has become archaeological investigator, revealing secrets buried in ice by melting the concealment that protected them. Dr. Klaus Brenner, the glaciologist whose September 2023 expedition discovered the site, reflects on this intersection of climate science and historical justice. We came here to document glacial recession, to measure how warming affects alpine ice. We found instead evidence of human flight, desperation, and calculation. The irony is that the same climatic processes destroying glaciers worldwide also expose historical artifacts we didn't know existed. We're simultaneously losing environmental heritage and discovering human history. Both processes remind us that nothing stays buried forever. The shelter contents, now preserved at Austrian National Archives, represent a physical timeline of escape. Wehrmacht identification marking who he was, forged civilian papers marking who he became, journal entries marking the psychological transition between identities, gold coins marking the resources enabling survival, and maps marking the geographical knowledge making escape possible. Visitors to the archive exhibition in Vienna can see these artifacts displayed alongside enlarged photographs of the Alpine site, the Buenos Aires property deed, and Emma Schiller's preserved letters. The exhibition is titled The Spaces Between: Lives Lived in Historical Cracks. It explores how individuals exploit the gap between official records and lived reality, between documented death and actual survival, between justice intended and justice evaded. One display case contains a particularly powerful juxtaposition: Hofer's Wehrmacht photograph from 1943, showing a lean-faced officer with haunted eyes, alongside the Hans Mitterer forged papers, showing the same man in civilian clothes with forced neutrality in his expression. The two images are separated by perhaps 6 months of actual time, but represent a chasm of identity, a conscious self-transformation from German officer to Austrian civilian, from participant in military occupation to supposed innocent refugee. The exhibition asks visitors to consider: how many others made similar transformations? How many former perpetrators lived peacefully in post-war societies, their histories unknown to neighbors, their pasts carefully concealed? The Alpine shelter represents not an exception but an example, one of thousands of escape routes, identity transformations, and successful evasions that define the post-war era. For the Yugoslav families who lost relatives in Wehrmacht operations Hofer helped plan, the discovery brings no material justice. The perpetrator died decades ago, unpunished, comfortable. No prosecution is possible. No compensation will be paid. But there is perhaps minimal satisfaction in historical truth. The man who helped destroy their communities, who then escaped accountability, who lived in Argentine exile until natural death, did not entirely escape consequence. His escape route is now documented. His complicity is now established. His name is now associated with evasion and moral failure. This is cold comfort, but it's the only comfort historical truth can provide when legal justice proves impossible. The question the shelter's discovery poses to contemporary society is uncomfortably direct. When does the statute of limitations on historical truth expire? When do we stop searching for evidence of past injustices? When do we accept that some secrets will remain permanent? The answer emerging from this investigation is never. Truth has no expiration date. Justice delayed may be justice denied, but historical accountability remains possible even after all participants are dead. The act of documentation, of establishing what happened and who did what, serves purposes beyond prosecution. It serves memory. It serves the historical record. It serves the principle that actions have consequences even if those consequences arrive decades late. Friedrich Wilhelm Hofer escaped the Wehrmacht, escaped Allied justice, escaped legal accountability. But he did not escape history. His refuge, buried in alpine ice, preserved the evidence of his survival until climate change and glacial recession exposed it to contemporary investigation. The Earth kept his secret for 78 years, then surrendered it to researchers who reconstructed his escape, traced his route, documented his complicity, and established the uncomfortable truth. He got away with it during his lifetime, but he cannot escape judgment after his death. There is something almost poetic in this. The mountains that sheltered his flight eventually testified against him. The ice that concealed his refuge melted away. The documents he preserved carefully to establish his false identity became the very evidence proving his deception. His own planning and documentation, done to ensure survival, became the trail investigators followed decades later to expose what he'd hidden. How many other secrets do the mountains hold? How many other refuges, caches, and waypoints remain frozen, waiting for glaciers to recede, waiting for climate patterns to shift, waiting for researchers to discover what their builders assumed would stay hidden forever? The Alpine shelter at 47,0892 degrees N, 12, 7,186 degrees E is no longer a refuge. It's a memorial to evasion, a testament to the limits of escape, and a reminder that Earth eventually surrenders what human beings try to bury. Sometimes the ground keeps secrets for 78 years, but eventually, inevitably, those secrets surface, and then the reckoning begins, even if it arrives too late for conventional justice. Standing at that shelter entrance, 2,187 meters above sea level, looking across peaks and valleys that witnessed one man's calculated disappearance, you understand. Geography and time can create distance from consequences, but they cannot create escape from truth. The mountains watched Friedrich Hofer hide in 1945. The mountains watched him walk away toward Switzerland and eventually Argentina. And the mountains, through glacial processes of revelation, watched him fail to stay hidden forever. That is perhaps the only justice the dead can receive, the certainty that eventually, somehow, someone will know what happened. The Alpine shelter discovered in September 2023 proves this principle. No matter how carefully you plan your escape, no matter how thoroughly you conceal your past, Earth has a longer memory than human life spans. And when that memory surfaces, decades after you believed you'd escaped all accountability, history finally gets its chance to judge.